So welcome everyone, and welcome to those listening on YouTube. We appreciate your presence here with us today. Today's topic is liberating ourselves from the false, limiting identity of our past. And what we're going to talk about today is the extreme importance, the imperative nature of discovering our old limiting stories and beliefs about ourselves. These stories were the mechanism through which we resisted feeling our feelings along the way during our life. They are the way that we held the energy, the vibrational density that Panache Desai talks about, the samskaras. And so these stories add weight as we move along in our lives. They become heavier. And the danger of our stories is that we attach every experience to our stories and make them further proof that our stories are true. And so our stories become an identity through which everything that happens to us gets filtered. Our identities are limited identities from our past based on stories that are untrue, that are based on false beliefs, become the filter through which we see and judge every experience in our lives. And so what happens is that we make our stories true as we move into our lives. We carry our stories with us and we make them true. Last week we talked about discovering our true identity, our true spiritual identity through the healing journey. And we talked about as we move along into this journey and we start to open up to our feelings and allow our feelings and start to move through the path of the open-hearted, emotionally available warrior, so many feelings start to come up for us and it starts to feel overwhelming. We're laughing and crying at the drop of a hat. It feels like life is being lived in Technicolor. And what we spoke about is that the overwhelm that happens really comes from the resistance and the contraction to feeling our feelings, because we're attaching all of those feelings to a heavy and old story of me, a heavy and old belief system about ourselves that makes us take everything that happens personally and makes us refer everything to that old story of how perhaps we're unworthy, we're not good enough, how this moment is a problem and we're not okay in this moment. And so as we start to move through our journey and feel our feelings, we become triggered because the feelings are attached to an energy of an old story, of old thoughts that we've held on to maintain and not feel the uncomfortable feelings that were being triggered by our lives. And what we talked about was that as we moved through our healing journey and started to do our density detox, again what Panache Desai calls it, or as we heal and release our samskaras or our repressed emotions from the past, which have gotten stuck in our hearts, in our consciousness, in our bodies as dense energy patterns. And those dense energy patterns have been attracting experiences to us through the law of attraction that were meant to trigger those experiences. But if we don't allow those experiences to come up, those feelings to come up, and allow them to be felt fully and released, we will continue to attract the same types of experiences. And so that is how our story becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because we hold on to an energy that attracts more of the same energy to us. But what we talked about is that as we start to heal and cleanse and detox ourselves of this dense energy of our repressed feelings and pain from our past, the stories start to loosen. The stories start to come up to be seen and acknowledged and felt. The strong hold that these stories have on us starts to loosen because we are allowing our feelings to move through us. And so we are more able, as time goes on, to release old energy patterns in our body, to feel our feelings along the way. And so there is a momentum to the healing journey as we start to feel and release our feelings. We start to see and acknowledge and become conscious of the stories that were holding those feelings in place. And so we start to lighten. We start to have more access to our spiritual centers, to be able to be more present. We start to take things less personally. Because as we release these old stories, we no longer attach everything that happens to us and every thought and every feeling and every sensation to an old story. And so we start to meet our lives fresh in the moment without referencing an old story about ourselves, a heavy old story. And as we start to release the heavy old stories of our lives, our identity shifts. Our sense of ourselves shifts. Our self-image shifts. And first, we start to go from a poor or low self-image, as they call it in psychology, to a better and higher sense of self, more self-love, more self-appreciation. And then even further down the road, we start to release the need to have an identity or a self-concept or self-image as much at all anymore. That we're able to start meeting this moment without referencing what would John do, what should John do to maintain some constant identity from his past. What would John do in this moment to keep up the same image that he had in the past? We start to no longer need to reference an old identity. And we start to be able to only do what is called for in each moment. We're more connected to our spiritual centers because we're not blocked by all the feelings that we're trying not to feel, that are disconnecting us from our centers. And so we're spending more time connected to spirit, connected to our inner voice, our inner guidance system, connected to a sense of peace and serenity. And so this moment becomes more okay than it was before, and we dig deeper into our centers. And then when something happens, it's no longer attached to an old story of how we were a victim or how things happened to us because we don't deserve good things, or any old story. And so we meet the moment fresh, and we feel the energy of the universe coming through us, guiding us into right action. How do we respond in this moment? We don't need to refer to an old self, an old identity, based on false, limited stories about ourselves. We can meet this moment fresh and respond openly, and respond from a place of expansion and excitement. And so we're made new, and our identity becomes much more about connecting with the moment about being the awake, alive, conscious awareness, and less about an old story that we need to keep referring to. And so today I'd like to first talk about ways that we can identify our stories. And then do a bit of a deeper dive into my story to give an example of how over time we can excavate and clear and release these limited false identities. So our thoughts, we have spoken about many times. Our frenetic, frantic, constant, incessant thoughts that many of us are plagued with in life. And I think what's interesting is most of the first chapters of most of the greatest spiritual books I've read have all started with a chapter about describing the voice in the head. I think we all have it. And we all have been conditioned to listen to it and believe it, and to believe that voice. And then what we've heard on the spiritual path is that this voice is somehow an enemy, that we need to disregard it, that we need to figure out ways of not listening to it. And so I want to point out the subtle distinction between witnessing our thoughts and paying attention to our thoughts without grasping onto them, and distinguishing that from ignoring or making our thoughts an enemy. And what I'd like to say today, and again this comes from Panache Desai, who's been a great teacher for me these last few weeks, is that our thoughts are our friends, and that our thoughts are an opportunity for us to discover the repressed energy and feelings that are underneath them. That our thoughts are actually the clue to which we can unlock the treasure box of our vibrational density, of our repressed feelings, of our stories, and of our limited identity. And that if we can start to look at our thoughts and the patterns of our thoughts and become more awake and aware of them instead of unconsciously being led by them, we can start to discern what the energy is underneath and fueling those thoughts, what the unfelt emotions are that are wanting to be released through those thoughts, because our incessant thoughts are often a way that both we are trying, our body and our consciousness is trying to release our feelings, and also the way that we keep them stuck. And so when we come up with habitual thoughts, which become stories, they become oftentimes justifications for the things that happen and the way they make us feel, so that we don't have to feel the feelings underneath. And we spoke several weeks ago about how when we're children, if we don't get the love we need, it's too painful to think that our parents are somehow imperfect, and so we make ourselves wrong and we make it our fault. And so that begins the story of there's something wrong with me, I'm not worthy of love. And so that's an example of a thought that becomes a story, because there are feelings underneath that are too overwhelming to feel. And so while it seems that the justifications are helping us, actually these justifications and these thoughts and stories are locking those unfelt feelings into our bodies. And so because those stories And those thoughts are the mechanism by which the energy is locked in us. Our thoughts can become a clue to discover what those underlying feelings and stories are. And so what are the habit patterns of our thoughts? What are the things that we think about all the time when we have a moment of free time that we're not occupied by something we need to do, by some distraction? And we talked a lot about distraction the last couple of weeks, the addictions and distractions and the habits of escape from this moment that we keep ourselves occupied by so that we don't have to feel the feelings that want to arise. But when we are having moments of not being distracted, and we talked about the shenpa, the itch and the urge to scratch of that uncomfortable moment where we don't have anything to do with ourselves and we have an uncomfortable feeling and we reach out to make the not okay feeling go away and to escape this moment. So what are the thoughts? So in his book, Discovering Your Soul Signature, Panache Desai describes one person, one gentleman, who habitually would compare himself to his peers. And I think it's a great example because I know a lot of us do that, and I know I do that. And always comparing himself to other people and finding how he falls short. Constantly, obsessively thinking about how he compares to other people. And then beating himself up if he seems, or if he feels or thinks that somehow the other person is doing better than him, is more successful than him, is happier than him. Constantly comparing. Or going on brief ego boost fantasies about how he feels better about himself because he deems himself somehow superior to the other person. But more often, inferior. An inferiority complex that we talked about weeks ago, that what the psychologists would call it. Comparing and despairing is a great phrase that we hear in spiritual circles. And so what he discovered was the underlying feeling underneath all the comparing was a deep-seated insecurity, a deep-seated feeling of unworthiness, of there being something wrong with him. And under that, a fear that he was not okay, that he was not important, that he was not loved. And so he was able to use the wisdom of the frantic thoughts and comparisons to unlock the unconscious feelings and then deeper the unconscious stories underneath those feelings, which are the energy patterns holding his life in place. Because our stories hold these energy patterns of samskara in our bodies, and those attract our experiences, and so this energy is holding our realities in place. Our stories are making themselves true. And so I wanted to share a bit about my story and start with my thoughts and habit patterns. And I do also, like this gentleman in the book, have a habit of comparing myself to other people. And I happen to have gone to an excellent college years ago, and I met two of my best friends at that excellent college. And ever since graduating, or a few years after, when I went on a path that was not a straight one for a while, and that when I tried to be a filmmaker and went on my own journey, I would constantly compare myself to my two friends who had much quicker success and had a much straighter path towards having the things that they knew they wanted in their lives, to making a lot of money, having career success, getting married, and having children. And so for over 20 years, every time I saw them or spoke to them or heard from them, I would compare myself to them, and I would come out and come up short. And I would despair, and I would beat myself up. And then there were some years that I knew that I would compare myself to them if I connected with them, and so I would avoid them and avoid other friends who went to this great school that I went to, because I perceived them somehow as being more successful and happier and having more of the things that they wanted in their lives. So that was one example of a habitual thought pattern of comparing and despairing. But even more than that, as I've done my work over the years, and even more recently, and never really understanding it as fully as I understand it today, I had a pattern of constantly worrying, of being in a state of almost constant anxiety all the time. The feeling that I was not okay in this moment, that this moment was a problem. Who I am right now is a problem that needs to be solved. I need to worry about what I need to do in order to solve the problem. I'm not okay as I am, and there's some okayness in the future that if I accomplish a lot, if I perform, if I become successful, if I do and accomplish many things, that I will one day meet a future where I can feel okay about myself, where I can be sufficient in my own view. So constantly worrying about what's next that I need to achieve. And no sooner would I be through finishing one achievement that I would be off to the next thing that I needed to accomplish without even taking a moment, or sometimes only a rare moment, to appreciate what I had accomplished. Because there was no end to what I needed to accomplish, because nothing that I could accomplish would make me feel okay right now. And so I was constantly in a state of anxious anticipation of the next thing that I needed to do, the race that I needed to run in order to one day cross the finish line of feeling better about myself, of feeling okay. And also this moment not being okay, and a constant fear that things would get worse, that things would fall apart, that even the things that I had put together, even the accomplishments or the life that I had built, always thinking the other shoe would drop around the corner. And so a constant state of worrying and anxiety about things going wrong, about things falling apart. So perpetually trying to achieve the next thing and run the race, and also perpetually worrying that something would go wrong and fall apart. And so because of this, I was in a constant state of alert, a constant state of hypervigilance and worry. And so the notion of relaxing and enjoying and playing was completely foreign to me. I wasn't built, I was not programmed to relax and enjoy my life. I was programmed to perform and achieve and work hard to reach some distant goal that I could one day feel better about myself once I reached it. And this moment could never be okay, because there was always a problem with it, because there was something wrong with me in this moment. So there was always a future moment where things hopefully could be better, but also a fear that they could be worse. And so through this, I started to have addiction issues, because when I drank, it was one time that I could relax and smell the roses. I could slow down for a change and enjoy myself and play and relax, finally relax. And so I used that in order to be okay in this moment, in order to relax and have some moment of enjoyment. But I couldn't do it without that, and as soon as the alcohol wore off, I was back to the worrying and the constant state of anxiety. And so through mining this worrying and this constant state of anxiety and being not okay with how things were, I got to know a story. And I've known the story pretty well over the years, but even more so very recently. And the story is that I have to catch up, that I'm a late bloomer, that there's something wrong with me, that I'm behind, that my friends who I went to this great school with had achieved the things that you're supposed to achieve by a certain time in life, and therefore I was behind them, and so I needed to race and catch up, because I was not worthy in this moment how I was. I needed to do more, be more, fix myself, and accomplish more. And so there was this drivenness of never being able to relax, of constantly striving and achieving. And on some levels, it looks like, on the outside, that after a period of having challenges with addiction and losing my way a bit, that I got my life together and I became successful on some levels. But the energy driving it was this old story of I'm not okay, I'm not worthy, I'm not good enough as I am, I need to perform for love, for acceptance, for appreciation, but even more than that, just to feel okay about myself. And so there's this story that has been my story for the last 25 or 20 or 30 years. Really ever since I graduated from college. That I'm the guy who's behind, who needs to race to catch up, and I have no time to appreciate, to have fun, or to relax. And playing is a luxury that I just can't afford. Enjoying my life is a luxury that I can't afford. And then I realized that even before my life started to change after college, and I started to get a bit lost in trying to become some self-image that I had of myself, trying to achieve. Even before that, there was a constant need to perform for approval. I was a good student, so my way of getting approval was to do well in school. I was constantly performing to get the approval of the teachers, constantly performing to get the approval of my peers in school. I went to some highly competitive schools, and I was on high alert that I needed to do well to gain approval, to gain acceptance. Because I wasn't really okay as I was. I needed to perform and do something, achieve something to be okay. There was no sense of security or loving myself for how I was. There was only judging myself for what I had performed, what I had achieved. And then even back before that, the feeling of performing in schools and grammar school and high school. And before that, the feeling of performing and achieving to gain the acceptance and approval of my very successful father. And then even before that, and I've shared a bit about this story, remembering how very early on in my childhood, when my parents were talking about getting divorced, and I felt that it was my job, because it was my fault that they were getting divorced, so it was my job to keep it from happening, to keep them together. Performing and achieving and being a good little boy so that they would love me and each other enough so that they wouldn't get a divorce, and even deeper than that, performing and achieving and doing so that my world wouldn't fall apart. Because to a child, a divorce feels like your world falling apart. And so the belief system and the story all the way back then started, which is, if I don't perform, if I don't achieve, my world will fall apart. I have to hold my world together. It's all on me. I have no time to relax and enjoy. I have no time to rest. I need to perform to keep things from falling apart. I need to hold them together. And of course, that's a false belief, because the divorce had nothing to do with me, and because trying to hold things together that are meant to fall apart or crack open is a useless waste of energy, as we learn later on in life, because we can't hold things together. But my story is, and was, I have to perform, I have to work hard, I have to achieve. There's something wrong with me. There's something wrong with me because my parents want to get a divorce and it must be my fault, so I'm not worthy of this, of the love that was required to keep the family together. There's something wrong with me. I have to make up for it. I have to fix it. And fixing it can be achieved through doing and achieving, and obsessively having goals that needed to be reached. And so I can see, as I look back on my life, how this limiting story, this false story of the late bloomer, the one who is behind, the one who is not okay the way he was, that he needed to catch up and do and perform, and there was no rest for the weary unless he had a drink. And the little boy who needed to perform and achieve to keep things from falling apart. How this became a story and a self-fulfilling prophecy that I kept making true. And so in some ways I would make it true through performing and achieving and having a semblance of keeping things together and getting positive reinforcement by being a good student, by being a good little boy, by being a good man, by being a good worker, by being a performer and getting recognition for it. There were also some times where my deep-seated belief that there was something wrong with me and that things would fall apart, my fear that things would fall apart, made my life fall apart a few times. I made that story true. And I got off on a bit of a tangent of my addiction and spent a few years where my life was not working, where things fell apart to a certain extent. Because I was carrying that part of the story true. I was carrying the story that things would fall apart. Because that's a part of the story of, if I don't perform for love and hold everything together, then they will fall apart. and so I will perform and hold everything together. But once I stop performing, it will fall apart. So holding the belief that, and the energy and the story that I'm a person that's not worthy, I'm a person for whom life will fall apart, makes those things true. And so, over time, and really not until very recently, and I'll even say not until today and this week and yesterday when I worked on this talk, did I really see the shift of letting this story go. Really starting to feel the feeling that I am okay in this moment. That there is no more race to run. There is no more place to arrive to. That there is nothing broken here. That there's nothing wrong with me as I am, and I no longer need to perform for love, for approval. And it has been a journey of releasing that old story, and as I've released parts of that old story, more has come into my life. As I've felt these feelings and become aware of that story about being a late bloomer and how I'm not okay and I'm not worthy, and mined my childhood for the beliefs that came from my childhood, I started to release this story. And yes, over time, my life provided more mirroring of positive self-image and more success, and some success in business came into my life, and family and love came into my life. And moving further on my spiritual journey and expressing my truth here with you all. But what's important is that it's not the things that are achieved, but it's the consciousness of okayness that gets you to the place of nothing is missing in my life. It gets you to the place of I am grateful for what I have. I celebrate the way things are. I realize nothing is missing and the whole world becomes mine, which is an adaptation of a Tao Te Ching quote. It's not the things that we have in our lives, although sometimes it takes gaining the things to feel better about yourself. But really it's the releasing of the stories and the limiting beliefs and identities of ourselves that are keeping the reality in place of our not having, of our not being worthy, of there being lack and limitation, and I can't have what I want. I'm not who I'm supposed to be. And as we release those stories through the feeling of those feelings, which starts with identifying our thought patterns, our habitual thought patterns, and mining them for what's buried underneath. It's not until we start to mine and release the stories and feel our feelings on this journey of the open-hearted, emotionally available warrior, that the stories release from our bodies, the energy of the stories release from our bodies, and so we don't attach every experience in our lives to an old, heavy story of our past sense of self, which became an identity for who we were. And so we don't say to everything that happens, well, I tripped on the street and fell on a crack, really because that's the way my life is. My life sucks and I'm unworthy. And so I tripped on the crack in the street because I'm unworthy. And doesn't that prove it once again, yet again, that my life sucks and I'm unworthy? And that it's been just like that my whole life. As opposed to, I've released the story, the heavy story of my past, and I can trip on a crack on the street and not make it a problem or not take it personally and not attach it to an identity of the unworthy, unfortunate me. But I can trip on a crack on the street, straighten myself, feel the feeling that starts to come up of, wow, this sucks, and can I attach it to my other things in my life that have been hard and unfortunate? And witness those thoughts and feelings coming up, but not go with them. Allow them to come up, feel them. Feel those old feelings of course these crappy things happen to me because I'm not good enough, I'm not worthy. My life sucks. Feel those things, see those things, release them, and then move forward knowing that the crack on the street had nothing to do with anything other than me not looking down properly while I was walking. That they don't have to be attached. It doesn't have to be attached to an old story. And so we become liberated in this moment, as I spoke about earlier. We're no longer referring to a story, seeing the world through the filter of a story, of an old identity, about how things have happened to me in the past. We no longer have to behave in old ways of contracting and defending ourselves and protecting ourselves and resisting and hiding and running away when scary opportunities present themselves instead of stepping in courageously and feeling our fear and doing it anyway. We can be liberated in each moment from these old stories and old identity to be made new. To be seeing our lives with fresh eyes. To be fully present in the moment like I can finally be now. And there isn't a problem with this moment. And I don't have to bring an old story to this moment. I can just be present with what is and respond from the connection to my spiritual center and do what the universe is asking me to do. What the internal GPS, what the voice, the still small voice of spirit, of God, of source, moving through me, tells me to do. I can follow my energy. I can follow my bliss and my passion. I can move into new directions that have nothing to do with the old directions, with the old limits. I can be and do all the things that I have always hoped for, without being stuck in the story that good stuff will never happen to me. I'm not worthy of it. I'll never have, I'll never be. I'll never have, I'll never be turns into I am, and I will do, and I will have. But even more importantly, I don't need to do and have in order to be okay in this moment, connected to myself, to spirit, contented and grateful for what I have in my life, knowing that in this moment nothing is missing. And while there are problems, or there are perceived problems or challenges, they are not part of an unfortunate and heavy and weighty, sad story of me. They're just challenges that arise that can be met with an open mind and an open heart and a fresh perspective. And so I'll ask all of you, as you move into your week, what are your stories? What are your old limiting stories? And how have they become an identity of the poor me, the unworthy me, the unfortunate me, the unhappy me? And how have I seized onto those unconscious stories and made them true? And how can I bring those stories first into consciousness? By starting with my incessant and habitual thoughts, writing down my thoughts, allowing them to come up, befriending them instead of resisting them, and discovering and looking for what is the pattern that my thoughts are making, And how can I use that as a clue to discover what's underlying? What is the feeling that wants to be released through these thoughts? What is the story that's being held in place by these thoughts? And even deeper, what is the identity? What is the energy pattern that I'm holding on to unconsciously? And we do this unconsciously. That is making my reality what it is. The energy that I hold creates the reality. As soon as I fully experience and release the energy of my reality collapses, dissolves into something new. So how can I discover my false and limiting beliefs and stories and identities and start to liberate myself from them? And I'll just ask for you to ask yourself this week, do you want to be made new? Do you want to see with fresh eyes? Do you want to release the old, worn out, limited, small identity that you've been holding on to, that has been holding on to you unconsciously? Do you want to make it conscious and release it and say goodbye to it? How has it served you? And how are you ready to now let it go and move into a new place of your life where everything you thought could not be yours could be yours? But even deeper, there is nothing you need to do, no one you need to be, nothing you need to achieve, no one you need to perform for, because you are, in this moment, loved and adored and perfectly okay, just as you are. Thank you.